I have the privilege today of introducing to you two eminent members of the European Parliament based in Brussels, but my guests are from Ireland. Clare Daly, I welcome you, and Mick Wallace, I welcome you. I have just recently seen Mick in action in the European Parliament, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here in my animal farm, named after George Orwell's book, which is all about dominance and submission. And that is how I would like to basically steer the conversation today. We are talking about climate change and its impact. We have learned to use the rhetoric of climate change and climate change mitigation and adaptation. But today I'd like to talk about causalities, the relationship between an action and then a reaction, and then the inaction that basically we are faced with in terms of the lack of responsibility taken by states. And of course, at an individual level, I think we are all to be held responsible for inactivity. Just to set the context, I believe you have come to Pakistan and you have visited the flood-affected areas. Am I correct? Have you?
As it turned out, we actually didn't get to them, but we had hoped to get to them. But we would have failed to get to Lahore if we had gone, because it was the drive to the area and back was too long to make our connection to Lahore.
I understand that. How long have you been here in Pakistan now?
We arrived on Sunday morning, so it's a very short trip, and we're going back to Europe tomorrow morning.
And what is it that you were hoping for?
Well, I think when we go to another country, the thing that we want most from it is to get a feel for the people, to see who they are and experience a bit of them so that we understand them better. We came to listen, and so that we would know Pakistan and its people better.
I suppose it was an unusual trip in that it was not an official visit of the European Parliament, but it was officially sanctioned in part by the Pakistani government. So our earlier meetings in the earlier part of the week was with a number of the ministries, and climate change featured really strongly in those discussions in terms of the West's responsibility in that regard, particularly coming up now with the COP conference in Egypt, which Mick is going to go to. So we had those meetings in Islamabad, but then we sort of broke away from that group and wanted to come to Lahore to kind of meet more activists and people from the community. So we had the mix of both worlds, really. So to get an understanding of the situation in Pakistan now at this crucial time. And it's been...
I'm not sure how many people, or whether you have managed to meet activists, perhaps academicians, perhaps intellectuals. I think you're in the process of doing that today. But since you have met with government, I'd like to know what you took away from those meetings, because my primary concern is responsibility. You know, when you said that the West is responsible, I have a different take to some extent, because I mean, using these kind of umbrella terms such as the West is comprised of owners of production, the means of production and labor, and then everything in between. So when you met with government here, what did you come away with? What are they looking for?
Mick?
I'm not so sure that they were looking for anything from us. I suppose it was good that they were prepared to meet us, and we met with the department dealing with the floods. We met with commerce, we met with foreign affairs, and we met with human rights department. And to be honest, I mean, politicians as a rule tend to be a disappointing breed. Politicians don't really deliver. They don't really serve the interests of their people like they should, and that's true world over. I'm sure it's probably, I'd be surprised if it was much different in Pakistan in that sense as it is in Europe. so politicians very often, they tell you what you want to hear as well, and but in generally, I actually thought the people we met were decent. I find that the politicians in these countries in this region, we've been to Iran, Syria, Iraq, and we find the politicians of a higher caliber than at home.
It's interesting.
It doesn't mean that they're not gangsters. It doesn't mean that they don't tell lies, but I find them more capable. I suppose the minister that was probably the most impressive was the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, a lady whose name I forget.
Ms. Hina Rabbani.
Yeah. She was very much on our wavelength about the war. We admire the fact that Pakistan has stayed neutral. Europe, sadly, has condemned anyone that stayed neutral and that hasn't taken their side, and we regard it as a very stupid war. So we were heartened by the comments of the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs anyway on this issue.
Yeah, she's very savvy. She's very eloquent and knowledgeable. You did not meet with the minister or the advisor, I believe, or perhaps she's a senator, but she also is looking at climate change, and that's Sherry Rahman.
Didn't, but her presence has been registered in Europe. The general take would be that she has been pretty impressive in terms of when the disaster struck, in calling out, if you like, the developed world. And you're totally right on your comment. The ordinary working person who's, going on a little holiday or going out in their car, while we all play our bit, isn't responsible for the problems of climate change. But the advanced capitalist countries who've exploited the rest of the world for their own enrichment are the key contributors to the environmental disasters that are having an impact on the likes of Pakistan so cruelly. And she's been really impressive in calling out that loss and damage concept. And it was a theme in the discussions that we met with the ministry, like where they were talking about donations from the West. And we kind of said, well, donations are all well and good, but donations have a ring of a charity about them. This should be about reparations, because it's the direct actions that's happening in a different part of the world. It's people here who are suffering, and that's going to be the big debate in the COP talks in Egypt. And Mick's going there representing the Parliament at that. So they were strong on that. And I think you're going to be championing kind of that when you go to Egypt as well,
I think what you're saying, Claire, there's a lot that needs to be unpacked. I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to deconstruct, the rhetoric, because when I first heard the Minister, Sherry Rahman, speaking to the BBC, for instance, one of the favorite questions that, broadcasting asks is, again, about responsibility, and particularly the responsibility of the state in the creation of disaster. And the way I have learned my activism has to do with humans being responsible for disaster. Nature does what it needs to do. Nature works in terms of its survival as a force. Humans, I believe, are the ones who engender disaster, who foster and enable disaster. So when Ms. Sherry Rahman responded to the BBC anchor by completely denying the responsibility of the government, the state, in this case, the state of Pakistan, because I think we need to be very careful in terms of apportioning blame, so to speak, on the developed world for the constant kind of stream of disasters that we are hit with in the developing world. Because after all, you've had Hurricane Ian. You've had drought in Italy, in Germany, in France. You've had temperatures in Great Britain going up into the mid-40s. It's unprecedented. It's unknown. So, it is closer to home now for the West. My issue is, and I would like a response from you. Government is responsible for policy formulation and also for the implementation of policy formulation. And parliamentarians such as yourself are, of course, also political, are also part of the political ferment. Now, when deforestation takes place with impunity, That is a failure of government. A, on the policy level, and then again on implementation. We have had a massive failure. The forest cover has shrunk to being less than 4% in Pakistan, that is a responsibility that our government needs to take. We cannot apportion blame, to the West, to Western politicians, or even to Western capitalism as such. Okay, because the timber mafia is not feeding that industry. They're feeding themselves, obviously. Then you have issues such as land use management. Then you have issues which I believe is at the core of every other issue of human existence, is the right for women to determine their fertility. I think that lies right at the bottom of this entire edifice which is crumbling around us. Because when you talk in terms of land use management, where there is no management, but there are, of course, all kinds of plans which are gathering dust somewhere. Burgeoning populations are largely seen to be pushing the growth of urban squalor, literally urban slums, squatter settlements, because there isn't room, there isn't space. So riverbeds are now becoming home to people who are pushed off the land. Therefore, I see, when you unpack things, that women's right to be able to determine their own fertility is a core issue which is never discussed. The business of reproductive health and rights is never brought onto the table. When you're talking about climate change, does it have anything to do with it? Indeed it does. Indeed it does. It is a causality, and it is also a result, because if you had been to the flood affected areas, or any area, forget about the flood, women are the greatest sufferers in terms of the intake of food, in terms of violence, the experience of violence, marginalization, the inability for children to go to school if they happen to be girls. The fact that child intake of nourishment is lesser than that of a boy, and the fact that in these countries, such as India, Bangladesh, South Asia in general, the global biological norm has been reversed because of female feticide. We have fewer women now in our population in terms of a proportion, right? So those conversations need to take place, I believe, here as well as where you come from. It is, I think, a question of rights. And you met with people in the Human Rights Department. You've just mentioned this, Mick. How do you connect the issue of rights here in what we call a developing country to where you come from, the heart of Europe, in Brussels? And then, of course, you have a background of Ireland, which has had its own history of deprivation, of colonization. How do you see that as being the connecting force to bring these humanities together? Because essentially, this is not a question of the West versus the rest of the world. The West is having its own disasters and its own conflict, which doesn't seem to be taken into account when this conversation is unfolding. COP doesn't talk about what is happening in the West, does it? It's always the starving Sahel, the Horn of Africa.
Listen, you've raised enough points there now for us to talk for the rest of the day. And just to go back to your first one about deforestation, and you're right, if the tree cover in Pakistan has been devastated, then of course the governments of the day have a responsibility towards that. If we look at probably the worst deforestation in the world has happened in Brazil. And the Brazilian government has been in the Amazon, and the Brazilian government has been guilty in failing to manage it and allowing big agri destroy the place. But
those are, would you say that there are vested interests within the government which protect those interests?
There's vested interests in most governments. Right?
Capture by big agri, big.
You must remember, right? In Europe, right, we import most of our feed for our animals. First of all, we have too much cattle. We have put our own grain producers out of business in a place like Ireland because it costs too much to grow it there. We're buying filthy cereal from Brazil at a cheap price to feed our cattle to sell dairy products and meat to the better off in the world. Brazil is cutting down more forests because we're buying more stuff from them, right? And we don't seem to give a damn about, we say we care, but if we did, we'd stop buying their contaminated cereal and their beef, right, which is full of chemicals that are, some of them banned in Europe. And God knows there's chemicals in Europe that should be banned as well. But we actually, we've banned chemicals in Europe that we actually sell to the third world now, right? And then we buy their products back off them, so we're eating it anyway.
Yeah.
So
it's a lose-lose proposition.
So Brazil is culpable in cutting down forests in the Amazon. Europe is culpable in continuing to grow its imports from Brazil without any traceability, without any concern what is happening to the indigenous people in the Amazon or whatever, right? So we're not innocent. And you ask about just, I mean, I'm sure Clare will pick up on some of the points, but on the issue of human rights, of course it's central to everything. But if you sat in the European Parliament and listened to them talk about human rights, they talk about freedom of expression, they talk about freedom of the press and political rights for individuals and the right to choose
sexual identity.
But they will not talk about the right to a house, the right to a job, the right to affordable healthcare, the right to a good education. They will not talk about the fact that poverty is a violation of human rights. They don't go to that space, right? We have neoliberalism has done a piece of work on the concept of human rights, and now it's something that fits with the markets. It doesn't fit with humanity.
My take on that, Mick, if you may allow me, is that, if you expand the example you're giving of the European Union to the United Nations, where I served as an ambassador, and I believe I'm the only one who's ever resigned, because it's a very glamorous thing to, hang around Angelina Jolie and, yeah. I mean, it was the biggest sham going. And I was ashamed to be identified when the second war in Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan took place, and the United Nations proved itself to be yet again another kind of a lame duck institution. Why I want to build this into the conversation is that, COP, all of these grand congregations of powerful people. I mean, you used to have the World Social Forum, and then, we're left with only the World Economic Forum, right? So the kind of marginalization of the people has been done in a very clever way, because you still have the conversation about rights, but those rights are being defined for us. So if we look at the so-called rights-based framework that has been developed in these hallowed bodies such as the United Nations, perhaps the EU as well, you have these lists, like the MDGs, and now replaced by the SDGs, with the word sustainable, which is very sexy, and but those lists are not sustainable without structural change. So I was the enfant terrible when I served as an ambassador, and in Geneva, I would basically just protest, because I would tell my colleagues that this sounds like a child's Christmas wish list. Halving poverty by such and such, getting kids into school by so and so, the timelines. None of that has anything to do with the structures of power, which are based on the structures of ownership. So can we, and so I bring this back to you, Clare, women, of course, are hardly owners of resources, of assets. Decision-making regarding the rest of the world is made by very few people, whether it's, I'm not going to, start talking in terms of specifics, but we know that is probably 1% of the world's population. So when we talk about damage and even reparations, I mean, you know, this is again a very, for me, it is an important subject. It's a much wider subject. Reparations, you know, how far back does one go for reparations? But I still believe that this conversation needs to actually go in another direction altogether. And the conversation at the international level cannot just be about mitigation and adaptation. You know, it's like having allowed for this monster to grow. You know, from the industrial era onwards, we see the rise in global temperatures. And of course, the consequences of that are very clear all over the world. It's not just the floods in Pakistan. You would agree, right? So, how can yourself, myself, and others who are becoming conscious that there is something wrong, there is something missing in this global agenda, how can we build an understanding where we are more connected with each other in terms of the structural issues which lie at the bottom of this monster that has been created?
Wow. You've touched on so many issues and it would take so long to deal with them. But look I mean, they are the key issues. And you're right that we have all these grand bodies at an international level with lovely aspirations. And yet the reality for ordinary people, no matter where they are, is being set back. And I mean, I can understand fully how when we talked about, from our perspective, I suppose, being in the European Union and looking at making Europe responsible for its footprint around the rest of the world and the modern day colonialism it engages in through its trade practices and so on. From the point of view of someone in Pakistan, you're totally right to focus on your government's actions as well, because all of us have to focus on the people who we can influence first and foremost. And I've no doubt that the Pakistani government has made choices which have undermined its ability to cope better, absolutely. And despite all their promises that they were learning now and going to do that, I've no reason to consider that they're any better than any other government. So they probably won't do enough because, as you say, power and decision making is not in the hands of the people who benefit from it most. And the root of the problem, we would say, is ultimately international capitalism. And unless you address that, and the people in power globally won't do that because they are captured by the lobbyists of those very same corporations who they're working for. So, you know, they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot. They definitely aren't. So to protect their own vested interest, because the planet is in trouble, they know they have to curtail some of the worst elements of the climate disaster, which ordinary people everywhere, including in Europe, are suffering from absolutely dramatically. But I suppose where we're sitting, the crisis is so catastrophic that actually whether the planet will even survive this, I don't know. Like, will we even have the luxury to talk about the issues which you've highlighted, which are absolutely the role of women in this, and why is it never put on a link with climate change being the biggest victims, if you like, of it, and the whole issue of the right to decide in terms of reproductive health and so on? Because actually it was a much bigger topic internationally in the context of global poverty and all of that before. It's actually something now that has totally receded. And in the context of, I suppose, of the rollback of Roe v. Wade in the US, this elimination of rights in Europe, where people thought, oh, we win these women's rights to decide what to do with our body and then it'll be there forever. No, it's not there forever. And then not to mind areas of the global south where people haven't got the support to decide for themselves as well, and the planet paying the price of that. It's scary stuff, but how do you bridge it? I don't know. I suppose through conversations like this, we find it interesting that, you know, we're from a tiny little country on the periphery of Europe that half the world hasn't heard of. We happen to get elected to the European Parliament, which, you know, is pretty undemocratic, even though we were directly elected. It is a body that is far removed from the citizens of Europe. And yet we find when we do speak and use the platform that, ironically, social media has been a vehicle to put that message out, challenging global capitalism, the need for world peace, for an interaction across international. And it's a mess. We get people from every corner of the world contacting us every day. So people are crying out for a conversation around that, I suppose.
Mick, just before you have something to say, I'm getting this wonderful feeling right now, and I therefore feel compelled to say this. How do you grow activism in this direction? Because of course we've got wonderful young people. We've got Gerta Thunberg. She has asked the right questions, but there are more questions that need to be asked. So there's just you and Mick right now. How are we going to take this to scale, this conversation?
Well, an awful lot of the issues that you've raised are linked to problems with who's making the decisions.
Yes.
And if you go to the European Parliament, there's two huge big elephants in the room that are not discussed. One of them is the fact that capitalism has failed from the point of view of the planet. We're not going to solve the climate crisis if we leave capitalism intact. Number two, there's no talk of degrowth.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's almost an evil word, right? But without degrowth, we are not going to stop the planet from burning.
Yeah.
So we're back to, okay, why are the decision makers not making good decisions? And a great example of it is the approach to the Ukraine war in Europe at the moment. 90% of the politicians have been content to promote the war in the European Parliament. The Commission, the European Council. There's three bodies in the European Parliament. We have the European Commission, we have the Parliament, and the Council. The Council is made up of the foreign ministers of the different 27 member states. They hold their meetings in secret. The Commission is the most powerful body, and they're unelected. And the Parliament are the only ones that are elected, and we cannot initiate legislation, right? So we have a lot of problems, and there's a serious deficit of democracy.
It almost sounds like the Freemasons. Sounds like the Skull and Bones Club.
Can feel like that.
Now, if 90% of the members of the elected members of the European Parliament are promoting the war that the people of Europe don't want. A very good survey was done last June by the European Council for Foreign Relations, a European body, and the main question asked was, do you want peace or do you want to punish Russia? 70% wanted peace across, they surveyed 10 countries in Europe, a wide-ranging survey. 70% had wanted peace, right? And yet 90% of the politicians want war. Okay, so what's wrong? Well, the truth be told, that the politicians do not represent their citizens, and that's a big problem.
Yes.
NATO are based in Brussels.
That's the irony.
NATO are based in Brussels, right? They're having more influence over our politicians than their citizens are, right? What, you might say to yourself, well, these people are elected to the European Parliament, so did the people not put them there? Right. Well, first of all, there's been such a dumbing down of politics in Europe by the mainstream media. They have almost encouraged people not to vote, right? And the people with a vested interest in getting their people into power, they're voting. The young people, unfortunately, are not voting, and the poor people are not voting, right? And we're ending up with people almost picked by the mainstream media who are bought and sold and in the pocket of US imperialism from our perspective. Europe is awash with think tanks run by the Americans, connected to all the media outlets. It's a horror scene. So that might be seems like we're moving away from the debate about how do we solve the challenges, but that's
that is setting the context for where we need to start from. And do we? I mean, I know that this is not a one-go conversation, or one is not expecting either of you to come up with any solutions. But I think this is a wonderful beginning. It's charging me up to basically take the role that I can play, and each one of us has an important role to play. Now, when you talk about the European Union and you talk about bodies which are obviously not democratic, so we were cutting through the farce of what these so-called democratic dispensations are supposed to represent. But as individuals, you have voice and voices, and I've heard and seen you, Mick, and it's like yay, somebody's got the courage.
She's better.
But my brother hasn't sent me her clips yet. I have to tell him to look for you. So now, we talked about international capitalism, both of you. You talked about imperialism. You talked about the control, the hegemonies that are still intact. Can environmental activism, let's say if we're just going to focus right now on climate change, because of course, if you're thinking systemically, climate change is it in terms of everything that has gone wrong, in terms of all the kind of policy and human behavior that has been engendered by an industry, by the industry of growth as opposed to degrowth. Now, here is where I need to understand. Can we rephrase even our own language that exists within activism for it to be more meaningful to people who are not necessarily part of the leadership of activists? Do you understand? For instance, degrowth. Degrowth itself is scary. It's scary because we've been brought up to believe that growth is it. And of course, we're talking about economic growth. But we also know that economic growth is not sustainable beyond, let's say, a certain percentage. And we know that there are experiences right next to us in China, where an economic growth rate of about 13.5% became disastrous for the environment. And of course, the environment is where we live. So obviously, it impacts all living things, not just us human beings. But can we come up with language and can we come up with actions beyond the throwing of mashed potatoes and tomato soup? That has its value. I'm certainly not taking away from it. But I believe that that conversation becomes, in a sense, criminalized, or, that activity becomes criminalized because it is a criminal act in terms of the preservation of art. How can we start working with younger people in Europe, in my country, where the language and the thrust is one in terms of structures of power? Degrowth obviously has to do with decisions to decide to slow down, breathe slowly, listen to the earth breathing. Is it just going to be rhetoric? I mean, can we go beyond this?
I get all the difficult questions.
You started it. There hasn't been any easy
I know
ones.
there hasn't been.
About?
But no, I mean, if I go back to, and you talk about young people, and you mentioned Greta Thunberg, and there's no doubt that the protest actions of the young people of Europe, for example, actually dictated in some ways the outcome of the last European elections, in that for the first time you've got a huge green group elected and everybody wanted to be green. It was the sexy one to be in, to get on that committee. Nick got on it, I didn't, but everybody wanted to be on it because that was where the action was. Europe was going to deal with this. Then suddenly the war comes along, all of that out the window, all of the goals gone. The actions that they're taking now are they're going back to burning coal. They've thrown out all the goals. So they speak out of two sides of their mouths. But there hasn't been a corresponding movement from people against that. And I suppose the first lesson is to explain to young people in Africa that just action to get people elected and elections are not the answer, that you have to deal with the system. Now, for us, in the context of the war and the response of the European Union to just go along with NATO's agenda in terms of Ukraine has led us to believe that the future of humanity lies actually in the global south. Not that Europe is finished. We don't believe that. We do know now that ordinary people in Europe feel climate change. So it's not a middle class luxury thing for a rich person to buy some organic vegetables that cost more money, where a poor person is just trying to get by. I think there's a greater understanding now from everybody that the climate is affecting us all, whether we like it or not. And this idea of there's people all over Europe now this winter with the energy crisis because of what's going on with the war in Russia. We're back to burning coal. The price of energy has increased massively. And there are loads of people are going to die in Europe this winter because of that. People are actually choosing between heating or eating. Such is the scale of it. So it's, I suppose that doesn't answer your question. It just poses another question. How do we link those issues to say to people who are the very victims of that that the struggle for a decent environment is actually totally bound up with the struggle for a decent standard of living? You can't separate the two, and both of them are connected with challenging the ownership of the means of production by that tiny minority who, as Mick says, if we don't deal with that, the climate catastrophe can't be dealt with. But it is hard to energise young people. But then on the other side of it, we are shocked, and all of the points about the European Union being so undemocratic, with the response that we've got all over Europe to our message arguing for peace, for diplomacy, for the empowerment of ordinary people themselves. So we would speak a lot about the neoliberal agenda of European capitalism in Africa or wherever. And we'd have loads of people from Africa contacting us going, saying, right, and we say, just leave Africa to the Africans, stop annoying them. The same in Haiti. They're going on about Ukraine and all this. Suddenly now they want to invade Haiti again and no one even talks about it. We say Haiti is the victims of years of foreign intervention. Get out of Haiti, US, and Europe, get out as well. Let them run it for themselves. So I suppose that is a message that's resonating throughout the world, that people need to go and organise in their own countries, cognizant that we live in a smaller global world, that if we all let everybody work together but separately, that people in their country have the right to do what they want, but benefit from that cooperation.
Just to give you a couple of examples of where people power can work, right? And people power can work anywhere, anytime. It does require organisation. In our own country, Ireland, right? The government tried to privatise water back in 2013. They had tried it back in 1996, and there was opposition, and they raised the money with a car tax instead of getting people to pay for water. We pay for it anyway through our general taxation, but they wanted to tax us directly, pay for it directly, so then they could privatise it, right? People fought against it. Unbelievable protests took place. The people, they were energized by it because they didn't want to be paying. They just thought it was wrong, and they knew it was going to cost them a fortune if it was privatized. And they went on the streets. The government had to back down. Now, young people, right? 5 out of 6 of the Irish young people have not voted in the last 2 general elections. 5 out of 6 under 26. Under 26-year-olds have not voted in the last 2 general elections. But we had 2 referendums in the last 5 years, right? We had one on the right for a woman to choose on abortion. We had one on LGBT rights. The young people went on the streets themselves and they all turned up to vote, and we won both referendums. People power, right? Because the governments had failed to go there for their whole damn lives. They talked about it, wouldn't go there because they had too many of their constituents who didn't want it, right?
I think it's what you're saying, Mick, is for me, as a woman and as a women's rights activist as well, when you're talking about abortion rights, you're talking about Catholic Ireland.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, I'm very aware of the suffering of women who had to leave Ireland. I mean, my closest friend in the United States is actually a colleague of Gloria Steinem's, and she's the same vintage. She was probably the first political correspondent for either Time or Newsweek, a woman, right? And she was at Harvard, 7 generations at Harvard. She was of Irish extraction. You know, she was an O'Reilly. And her experience of having a child, because she could not have an abortion in the 1950s, and giving up that child for adoption, has altered her entire life. And you know, in the book she wrote has become part of the feminist literature now in the United States. So do we need more people like that to come and speak about things which have hurt them personally because of state policy, that can go beyond, of course, women's reproductive health. That
was a huge part of it. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And it really was women telling their own stories.
Their own stories, right?
Destigmatise the whole thing. And actually, when we were in the Irish Parliament first, both of us, actually, Mick was the first one to raise the issue of abortion in the context where it wasn't a personal tragedy of a woman dying in a big, what's going on here? Actually just initiating positively for abortion care to be broadened out and to end Ireland's ban. So we did a lot of work on that in the Irish Parliament, but now I can't remember, sorry, Timur, what I was starting off going to say.
Doesn't matter.
You're probably going to make the point that the politicians actually told us, don't go there. I'll tell you, you're going to get into trouble. Right? We've been there, we've done that. Don't go there, don't go there. And the politicians were scared of their life of it. But
I think that's fear-mongering.
Yeah,
that's
was at that time, and it's only like, it was about 10 years ago now, around that campaign, when we were in the Parliament, we were the first ones to introduce legislation to deal with abortion in Ireland. And 10 years ago, that was the first time women came out around that campaign and identified themselves as women who had had an abortion. And we were actually a bit wondering whether we should raise it. Would there be a backlash? Because, as you say, Catholic Ireland, but actually people then began to say, and every family had been touched by it. They maybe didn't talk about it. As you say, Ireland's hidden past, women incarcerated in what they called mother and baby homes. They weren't homes. Yes. People were locked up away. Their children were taken from them. Forced adoptions, illegally registered adoptions. People never even know
graves, identity. Little tiny graves.
Hundreds of children found in mass graves beside these so-called homes. Magdalene laundries, women sent in to work, the shame, the stigma for having a pregnancy outside of marriage. That's not that long ago when those last homes, and yet we went to, and because from a situation from that to the winning of abortion rights in Ireland being celebrated across the board, across all generations.
So if we were to take this as just an example of how the mind can evolve and behavior can change and legislation can follow, because I think it can work both ways. You can put legislation into effect and cause behavioral change, but in order to get the legislation in place in the first instance, there has to be a need expressed for it, which is obviously through a political process. I'm going to basically wrap up by going back to Europe and looking at the war and unpacking the war for what it means in terms of genuine conversation regarding the warming of the planet, the heating up of this planet. You've got big issues with energy, but do you? I mean, the question here is, can we actually undo the question itself? Is there going to be an issue in Europe with energy if degrowth becomes part of policy? Number one, I mean, the choice between heating and eating is a choice of basically life and death, right? But how much of a role does industry have to play in forcing you to make that choice? Okay. Then you have, of course, the whole business of importing grain from the Ukraine. How much can ordinary people start questioning just the business of the growth of cash crops or growth of sustainable products for Western tables at the cost of the agriculturist, the farmer, the peasant, normally landless, on the other side of the world. In other words, the banana republics on the other side of the world. That conversation has also disappeared. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, there's examples of that all over the world where the IMF and the World Bank have facilitated, they've lent money to countries on conditions where they produce these cash crops for exports, right? Yeah. Yemen is a great example where over 400,000 people are dead now and 16 million are starving. Yeah. Unbelievable, thanks to the Western support for the Saudi UAE genocide taking place there. But that started with the IMF and World Bank giving money to the Yemenis to actually grow crops that weren't for themselves. They were one of the most self-sufficient nations on the planet, right? And now they can't feed themselves, right? And there's several cases of it in Africa. But going back...
Central America is where it started with the conquistadores.
Linking the war to our environmental challenges, right? When we decided to fuel the war by pumping arms into it, making sure it wouldn't stop, Boris Johnson went twice to Kiev to prevent Zelensky negotiating with the Russians. NATO, US imperialism didn't want the war to stop. How many countries actually measured the increased carbon footprint from our actions? When the different member states in Europe decided that they were all going to increase their defense spend because we're no longer in a peace situation, we're in a war situation. Meat and drink to the arms industry, right? How many of them actually measured how much of that was going to add to their emissions and their carbon footprint? How many of them? Zero, right? It is horrific. And people should understand, and a big problem that we have, and if we're going to energize the people and get them to understand that, you know, this is their planet, right? And that they've got to take ownership of it, right? And don't expect those politicians to do the right things. You've got to force them to do it, and we've got to energize ourselves. It's really significant. We know that the aviation industry is a huge polluter. Well, the aviation industry is responsible for 2.5% of world global emissions, right?
That's right.
The military, which is predominantly dominated by the US empire, the military is responsible for over 6% of global emissions. Now, put that in context when you think that Pakistan is responsible for 1%. The whole of Africa, with 1.2 billion people, is responsible for 4% of the world emissions. And the military footprint is responsible for 6+, right? And we're saying we don't talk about it because our media won't print it. They won't talk about it. We've got to communicate better with the people. Social media is definitely a tool that can help because the mainstream media won't help. But we've got to inform them of what's really happening in order for them to go to the space and say, sorry, this is not what we want. We want a fairer society. We want peace. We don't want war. We want to deal properly and honestly with the challenges of the climate change impact. But it's a body of work for everybody to energize the people to go to that space.
But it's a brilliant way of putting it. Like you said, well, you know, if we looked at degrowth and all that, well, then you wouldn't have an energy crisis. Actually, you know, if we looked at real sustainable agriculture, we wouldn't have those problems. And in some ways you say, God, that's so simple. Why didn't anybody think of that? And of course, the simple things actually are the truth.
Absolutely.
But what we have burying that is a mainstream media and massive vested
interest. That's the imperatives of capitalism, which create that
so we
the need which is actually the greed.
Yeah, totally.
It's not a need
but
at all.
I think it's interesting what you were saying, like, and it is like that conversation about poor farmers in other parts isn't had anymore. And the reason is back to another point you made, that we put these fair trade labels on it, or we talk about SDGs and all these nice buzzwords, and it has actually become sanitized to continue the pillage in a different way. Like,
absolutely,
you know, so it is
and still to be seen as the benevolent, the benign.
It's been weaponized to allow it to continue, because otherwise, if it had continued, you know, without any restraint, well, then it would have been exposed itself quicker, I suppose. So, yeah, I mean, I think all of the points Mick said, we energize ourselves to debunk all that stuff.
Well, I think the conversation today has energized me. I want to be able to connect with you as an example of how connectedness basically can bring us together. And without that connectedness to the environment, to to nature, to the natural environment, we cannot believe in ourselves either, because we are very much a part of it and we cannot live without it. So I think this constant reaching out, like you have done, is not just welcome, it's absolutely essential if we are going to live for another millennium, another million years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.